The rain came down in heavy sheets, blurring the neon lights of Seattle's waterfront, as William Carter pulled the collar of his worn jacket tighter around his neck. At 60, the CEO of Carter Culinary Group, a sprawling empire of 20 upscale restaurants across the Pacific Northwest and beyond, was no stranger to the city's temperamental weather. But tonight, he wasn't the polished executive in a tailored suit chauffeured in a sleek black SUV. Instead, he trudged through the downpour like any other weary soul, his gray hair plastered to his forehead, his scuffed boots splashing through puddles. He was headed to Haven's Grill, the first restaurant he'd opened 35 years ago, in a gritty corner of Seattle back when he was a scrappy 25-year-old with nothing but a dream and his mother's recipes. Tonight, he was undercover, driven by troubling online reviews about declining service and a nagging sense that something was wrong with the place that had started it all. As he pushed through the glass doors of Haven's Grill, the familiar scent of roasted garlic and fresh bread hit him, but it was laced with something else. A tension that hung in the air like damp fog. The warm glow of pendant lights and the clink of wine glasses couldn't mask the strained energy in the room. William's heart sank. This wasn't the vibrant, welcoming haven he'd built from nothing, the place where he'd once known every customer's name and their favorite dish. He was here to see it through a customer's eyes, to understand why the soul of his first restaurant seemed to be slipping away. The hostess, a young woman with jet black hair and a bored expression, barely glanced up from her phone as she grabbed a menu. "Table for one," she asked, her voice flat, as if she'd rather be anywhere else. William nodded, noting how her fingers danced across the screen, more interested in her social media feed than in making him feel welcome. She led him to a wobbly table near the kitchen doors, the kind of spot reserved for nobodies, those unlikely to tip generously or complain loudly. As he settled into the creaky chair, William scanned the dining room. Servers moved with practiced efficiency, weaving between tables laden with steaming plates of pan-seared salmon and herb-crusted lamb, but their smiles were tight, mechanical, like actors in a play they'd performed too many times. The laughter from the diners felt hollow, and the usual hum of connection that William remembered from the early days was absent. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. This wasn't right. He'd built Haven's Grill to be a place where people felt like family, where a meal was more than food. It was a moment of belonging. But tonight, it felt like a machine grinding through the motions. Then he saw her, a waitress in her late 30s with auburn hair tied back in a slightly frayed ponytail, moved through the chaos with a quiet grace that caught his attention. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell, and there was something about her that stood out like a single candle flickering in a dark room. While other servers rushed past tables, barely making eye contact, Sarah lingered. She knelt beside an elderly couple, listening intently as they described their day, her smile warm and genuine. She refilled a child's water glass before it was empty, her movements calm despite the frenetic pace of the dinner rush. But William noticed something else, too, the way the younger servers whispered behind her back, their eyes rolling when she offered to help clear their tables. Sarah carried herself with dignity, but there was a weight in her shoulders, a subtle slump that spoke of burdens she wasn't sharing. Her smile faltered when she thought no one was watching, and William felt a pang in his chest. He'd seen that look before, years ago, in his mother's eyes when she'd worked double shifts to keep their family afloat after his father left. It was the look of someone holding it together when the world was pressing too hard. The dining room was alive with the chaos of a Saturday night. A tech entrepreneur at table 7 snapped his fingers, demanding another round of drinks with an air of entitlement. A family at table 3 argued loudly over the menu, their toddler tossing crayons onto the floor. An older woman at table 10 sent her soup back twice, insisting it wasn't hot enough despite the steam rising from the bowl. Through it all, Sarah moved like a seasoned dancer, her steps deliberate but never rushed. She apologized to the entrepreneur with a sincerity that disarmed his impatience, brought extra napkins to the family without being asked, and patiently explained the soup's preparation to the older woman until she nodded satisfied. William ordered a simple dish grilled chicken with rosemary and mashed potatoes. Nothing flashy, nothing to draw attention. He wanted to blend in, to observe without influencing. As he waited, he watched Sarah juggle 8 tables with a skill that only came from years of experience. She remembered that the man at table 4 wanted his steak rare, that the woman at table 9 was gluten-free, and that the teenager at table 6 was nervously splitting the bill with his date counting out crumpled bills with a shy smile. But then, something shifted. Sarah had just served a particularly demanding table, a group of corporate types who'd complained about everything from the lighting to the speed of service when she slipped into a narrow alcove between the dining room and the kitchen. For a moment, she thought she was alone. Her shoulders slumped, her hands trembled, and William saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. She was crying silently, her breaths shallow as she fought to regain control. His chest tightened. This woman, who'd been the heartbeat of the dining room, was breaking under a weight no one else seemed to notice. His food arrived delivered by a younger server who barely muttered, "Enjoy," before hurrying off. William barely glanced at the plate. His attention was fixed on Sarah, who'd composed herself in seconds, plastering that same gentle smile back on her face as she returned to her tables. But now he saw what he'd missed before: the faint tremor in her hands as she poured coffee, the way she took deep breaths between orders, the careful way she tucked her tips into her apron as if every dollar was a lifeline. As the evening wore on, William began to piece together Sarah's story through quiet observation. He noticed how she lingered with an elderly man dining alone, asking about his day with a warmth that made the man's tired eyes light up. She brought a small dessert to a young girl celebrating her birthday, even though the family hadn't ordered it, and William caught her slipping a few dollars from her own tips to cover it. When a customer spilled wine on his jacket, Sarah didn't just apologize, she offered to cover the cleaning cost. Her voice steady, even as the man berated her. William's mind flashed back to his mother, who'd done the same years ago, always putting others first, even when she had nothing to spare. He called Sarah over as she passed his table. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly, keeping his tone gentle. She turned, her smile practiced, but her eyes, weary lines of exhaustion etched into her face. "Yes, sir. Is everything okay with your meal?" she asked, her voice steady despite the strain. "It's perfect," William said, his tone warm. "I just wanted to say, you seem to really care about this place. How long have you worked here?" For a moment, something real flickered across Sarah's face, pride mixed with a trace of sadness. 10 years next week, she said, her voice soft but steady. "I started right after my son was born. Mr. Carter gave me a chance when I was a single mom with no experience, just desperation to provide for my boy." William felt a lump in his throat. He remembered that hiring decision, a fleeting moment in a busy day, but he'd never followed up to see how it turned out. "That must have been tough," he said, his voice low. "Starting over like that." Sarah's smile softened, becoming more genuine. "It was terrifying," she admitted. "But this job, it's been my lifeline. The people here, the customers, they're like family, even on the hard days." Before William could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Sarah, table 12 needs you. Now." It was the manager, James Thornton, a wiry man in his early 30s with a permanent scowl. His tone was clipped dismissive, and William didn't miss the way Sarah's shoulders tensed. "Of course, Mr. Thornton," she said quickly, turning to William. "I'm so sorry, sir. I hope you enjoy your evening." She hurried off, and William's gaze shifted to James, who was already barking orders at another server. As the night progressed, William watched James with growing unease. The manager moved through the dining room like a drill sergeant, his eyes scanning for mistakes rather than opportunities to connect. He saw James snap at a young busboy for dropping a fork, the boy's face flushing with embarrassment. He noticed how James ignored Sarah's suggestion to comp a drink for a customer whose order was delayed, rolling his eyes as if her input was worthless. And he saw how James prioritized the VIP tables fawning over wealthy patrons, while barely acknowledging the elderly man dining alone or the family with the restless toddler. William's anger simmered. This wasn't the culture he'd envisioned when he opened Haven's Grill. He'd wanted a place where everyone, staff and customers alike, felt valued, not just the ones with deep pockets. The breaking point came when Sarah approached James with a quiet request, her voice too low for William to hear. James's response, however, carried across the room. "If you can't keep up with the schedules, Sarah, maybe you're not cut out for this anymore. Plenty of people would kill for your job." Sarah's face flushed, but she nodded and walked away. Her head bowed. William saw her slip back into that alcove, and this time the tears weren't quick to stop. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Something was rotten in the heart of his restaurant, and it went deeper than a few bad reviews. He waited until Sarah emerged, her eyes red, but her smile back in place, and caught her attention as she passed. "Miss, could I speak with you for a moment?" he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I promise I'm not complaining." Sarah hesitated, glancing toward James, who was counting the register with a scowl. "We're closing soon, sir, and I have tables to clean," she said, her tone apologetic. "Please," William pressed something in his voice, making her pause. "Just 1 minute. I'm a business owner myself, and I think you could teach me something." Reluctantly, she sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Up close, William saw the calluses on her fingers, the faint stains on her mended apron, the bone-deep weariness in her eyes. "You mentioned your son," he said softly. "He must be about 10 now." Sarah's face lit up despite her exhaustion. "He's 11, she said, her voice warming. "Aiden. He's my whole world. He's special, you know. He sees the world differently, and it's not always easy, but he's got the biggest heart." Her smile faded slightly. "It's just hard sometimes. The medical bills, the therapies. I'm doing my best, but lately with my hours being cut." She stopped, embarrassed. "I'm sorry you don't need to hear this." William leaned forward, his voice gentle but probing. "Cut hours. Why would they do that?" Sarah glanced around nervously, then spoke in a near whisper. "New management rules. They say it's about efficiency. Fewer full-time staff means lower benefit costs. I used to get 40 hours a week, sometimes more. Now I'm down to 20, and they've hired part-timers to fill the gaps. I'm looking for a second job, but it's hard to find something that fits around Aiden's needs." William's jaw tightened. He'd heard about these efficiency measures from his corporate team, but he hadn't realized the human cost. Sarah's words hit him like a punch. Here was a woman who'd given 10 years to his restaurant, who treated every customer like family, and she was struggling to survive because of decisions made in a boardroom he'd approved. "I love this job," Sarah continued, her voice trembling with a mix of pride and desperation. "I love making people feel at home being part of their stories. But I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. Aiden's therapy costs are due next week, and I'm still short." William felt a memory stir his mother counting tips at their kitchen table, her hands shaking as she calculated whether they'd make rent. He'd promised himself he'd never let anyone in his employ feel that way, and yet here was Sarah living that same quiet desperation. He wanted to ask more, but James appeared beside their table, his expression dark. "Sarah, what are you doing? You've got side work to finish, and I'm not paying you to chat." William's blood boiled, but he kept his voice calm. "Actually," he said, standing slowly, his presence commanding the attention of the few remaining staff, "I'd like to know more about these new management rules you're enforcing." James blinked confused, then bristled. "Sir, we're closed. You need to settle your bill." And William cut him off, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "My name is William Carter," he said, watching the blood drain from James's face. "And I own this restaurant." The dining room went silent, forks pausing mid-air, servers freezing in their tracks. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. William turned to her, his expression softening. "10 years ago, I hired a single mother who walked in here with nothing but determination. I remember you, Sarah. You said you'd work harder than anyone if I gave you a chance. And you have. I'm the one who failed you." He faced James again, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk, now." As the reality of his presence sank in, William knew this night was only the beginning. Something had to change, not just for Sarah, but for every person who walked through these doors, staff and customer alike. The rain outside might have stopped, but the storm inside Haven's Grill was just beginning. William Carter sat at the same wobbly table near the kitchen doors of Haven's Grill, the weight of his revelation still hanging in the air, like the lingering scent of rosemary from his untouched chicken dinner. The dining room had emptied out, the last customers trickling into the Seattle night, their umbrellas bobbing under the streetlights. The staff, however, remained their movements slower now, casting wary glances toward William and James Thornton, the manager whose face had gone from pale to a sickly shade of gray. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen near the service station, her auburn ponytail slightly askew, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron as if bracing for what came next. William's heart pounded not with the thrill of power, but with a gnawing realization that the empire he'd built had cracks he'd ignored for too long. He'd come to Haven's Grill to uncover the truth behind customer complaints, but what he'd found was far deeper, a betrayal of the values he'd once held dear, and a woman whose quiet strength reminded him of a past he'd tried to forget. As the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, William knew he couldn't leave this unresolved. He needed to understand how things had gone so wrong, and Sarah, with her weary eyes and unwavering dedication, was the key. The air in the restaurant felt heavier now, the clatter of dishes replaced by an uneasy silence. James, still reeling from William's revelation, stammered, "Mr. Carter, I didn't know you were here. If I'd known, I would have." William raised a hand, cutting him off. "That's exactly why I didn't announce myself," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to make the young busboy nearby pause mid-sweep. "I wanted to see the truth. And what I saw tonight was a manager who treats his staff like liabilities instead of people." James opened his mouth to protest, but William's gaze silenced him. He turned to Sarah, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the woodwork. "Sarah, I'd like you to stay. I need to hear your perspective." Her eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at James, who shot her a look that was equal parts warning and desperation. "Sir, I don't want to cause trouble," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not causing trouble," William replied, his tone gentle but firm. "You're helping me fix it." Reluctantly, she nodded, pulling a chair from a nearby table and sitting down, her hands still clasped tightly as if holding herself together. William's mind churned as he studied Sarah. Her dedication to her customers was unmistakable. She'd handled a table of demanding tech executives earlier with a patience that bordered on saintly, even when they'd scoffed at her suggestions and left a measly tip. He'd watched her kneel beside a young boy who'd spilled his juice, calming his embarrassed mother with a kind word and a quick clean-up, her smile never wavering. But there was something else about her, something that tugged at a memory buried deep in William's past. 30 years ago, when Haven's Grill was just a dream, he'd had a server named Clara, a single mother like Sarah, who'd poured her heart into the restaurant. Clara had come to him one night, her hands trembling much like Sarah's had, in the alcove, asking for an advance to cover her daughter's medical bills. William, young and overwhelmed with the stress of keeping the restaurant afloat, had brushed her off, promising to look into it, but never following through. A month later, Clara quit, and he later learned she'd lost her daughter to a treatable illness. The guilt had haunted him ever since a shadow he'd buried under years of success and expansion. Sarah's quiet resilience, her ability to keep going despite the weight she carried, was like seeing Clara all over again, and it made William's chest ache with a regret he hadn't faced in years. As the remaining staff hovered nearby pretending to clean, but clearly listening, William leaned toward Sarah. "Tell me about your son," he said, his voice softer now, hoping to ease her into the conversation. Sarah's face brightened, though the exhaustion in her eyes remained. "Aiden," she said, a warmth creeping into her voice. "He's 11, almost 12. He's different. He has autism, and it makes some things harder for him, like school or crowded places. But he's so smart, loves drawing, and he's got this way of seeing beauty in things most people miss, like the way rain makes patterns on the window." Her smile faded slightly. "It's just been tough lately. His therapy costs keep going up, and the school says he needs a special aid to keep up in class. I'm trying to save for it, but with my hours cut..." She trailed off, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. William nodded, his jaw tightening. "You mentioned cut hours earlier. How did that happen?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at James, who was now fidgeting near the register, his earlier arrogance replaced by nervous energy. "It's the new policy," she said quietly. "Mr. Thornton said it came from corporate. They want more part-timers, fewer full-time staff. It saves on benefits, I guess. I used to work 40, sometimes 45 hours a week. Now I'm lucky to get 22, and I'm not the only one. They hired 3 new part-timers last month, and 2 of us full-timers lost half our shifts." William's anger flared, but he kept his expression calm. He'd approved broad cost-cutting measures during a board meeting 6 months ago, distracted by expansion plans for a new restaurant in Portland. He hadn't asked enough questions, hadn't considered what efficiency meant for people like Sarah. "That must make things incredibly tight," he said, his voice steady but laced with empathy. Sarah nodded, her eyes dropping to the table. "It does. Aiden's therapy is $200 a week, and that's just the co-pay. I've been picking up extra shifts at a coffee shop when I can, but it's hard to juggle with his schedule. He needs me there for his appointments, and sometimes he has meltdowns if I'm not home by bedtime." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't want him to feel like he's a burden. He's my everything." William felt that shadow of Clara again, her desperate plea echoing in Sarah's words. He wanted to apologize, to tell her he'd failed her just as he'd failed Clara, but he held back, knowing this wasn't about him, not yet. The dining room was nearly empty now, save for a few servers wiping down tables and the busboy stacking chairs. William's eyes drifted to James, who was now pretending to organize receipts, but clearly listening to every word. He'd seen James's management style all evening, snapping at a young server for mixing up an order, ignoring Sarah's attempt to suggest a special for a customer's anniversary, and prioritizing a table of venture capitalists over a family celebrating their daughter's graduation. It was clear James saw his staff as cogs in a machine, not people with lives and struggles. William's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at Table 8, where a group of well-dressed men in their 40s, likely tech executives from one of Seattle's many startups, were loudly complaining about their bill. Sarah stood to intervene, but James beat her to it, striding over with a forced smile. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone dripping with false charm. The lead executive, a man with a slick haircut and an expensive watch, jabbed a finger at the bill. "This is outrageous. $300 for a meal that took forever to arrive." And that waitress, he pointed at Sarah, who'd frozen mid-step. "She was slow, barely checked on us. I want a discount, or I'm leaving a review that'll tank this place." William watched as Sarah's face flushed, her hands clenching at her sides. She'd been attentive to that table all night, refilling their drinks, accommodating their endless modifications to the menu, even bringing a complimentary appetizer when their entrees were delayed by the kitchen. James, instead of defending her, nodded eagerly. "Of course, sir. Let me take care of that." "Sarah, why don't you apologize to these gentlemen?" Sarah's eyes widened, a flicker of hurt crossing her face before she masked it with that practiced smile. "I'm so sorry if I let you down," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll make sure your next visit is perfect." The executive snorted, waving her off, and James comped half their bill, fawning over them as they left. William's blood boiled. Sarah had done nothing wrong, yet she'd been publicly humiliated to appease a table of entitled customers. He saw her slip back to the alcove, her shoulders shaking, and he knew she was crying again, her composure crumbling under the weight of James's betrayal. William stood his chair scraping against the floor, drawing the attention of the remaining staff. "Sarah," he called, gently motioning her back. She emerged from the alcove, wiping her eyes quickly, her smile back in place, but fragile. "I'm okay, sir," she said, though her voice wavered. "Just needed a moment." William shook his head. "You don't have to pretend with me. I saw what just happened. You handled that table better than anyone could have, and you deserved better than that." Sarah looked down her fingers, twisting her apron again. "It's just part of the job," she said softly. "You get used to it." William's heart sank. No one should have to get used to being treated like that, especially not someone who'd given 10 years of her life to his restaurant. He turned to James, who was now hovering nearby. His earlier bravado gone. "James, explain to me why you threw Sarah under the bus just now." William said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made the room go still. James stammered, "I was just trying to keep the customers happy, sir. Reviews are everything these days, and those guys were big spenders." William cut him off. "And Sarah? What about keeping her happy? She's been here 10 years, and you let her take the fall for a kitchen delay she had no control over." James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Sarah, who looked like she wanted to vanish. "She's a good server, but she's slow. Sometimes," he said, his tone defensive. "She's always taking too long with customers chatting instead of turning tables." William's eyes narrowed. "Chatting? You mean treating people like human beings, like the way she calmed that mother with the spilled juice, or remembered that old man's favorite dessert?" He gestured toward the dining room, now quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. "That's what this place was built on: connection, not just profit. And you're punishing her for it." Sarah's eyes flicked up surprise, and something like gratitude flashing across her face. William turned back to her. Sarah, tell me honestly what's changed here since you started. What's making it so hard for you to do your job? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. It's not just the hours, she said, finally her voice barely audible. It's the way things feel now. We used to be a team like a family. We'd help each other, celebrate together. Now it's all about numbers, how fast we can turn tables, how much we can upsell. Mr. Thornton says it's what corporate wants, but it's like we're not allowed to care anymore. William felt a stab of guilt. He'd been so focused on expanding his empire, new locations, new investors, that he'd let corporate consultants reshape the culture of his restaurants without questioning their methods. He remembered Clara again, her face blurring with Sarah's in his mind. Clara had loved Haven's Grill too, had believed in its mission to be a place of warmth and belonging. But he'd let her down, and now history was repeating itself with Sarah. What else? He pressed gently. What else is making it hard? Sarah took a deep breath, her voice gaining strength. It's the little things. We used to have staff meals before shifts, where we'd sit together, laugh, share stories. It made us feel like we mattered. Now we're lucky if we get a 10-minute break to eat, standing up in the kitchen. And the customers, they can feel it too. They don't come back as often because it doesn't feel special anymore. William nodded, his mind racing. He'd built Haven's Grill to be a refuge, a place where people could escape the grind of life. But somewhere along the way, it had become a grind for the people who made it run. He glanced at James, who was now sweating visibly, his hands fidgeting with a pen. Is this true? James, William asked, his tone deceptively calm. Are you cutting corners on staff morale to hit corporate targets? James swallowed hard. It's not like that, sir. The numbers show we're more efficient now, higher table turnover, lower labor costs. It's what the board wanted. William's eyes darkened. The board doesn't work these tables. The board doesn't see Sarah staying late to clean up spills or using her own money to make a kid's birthday special. Efficiency doesn't mean anything if you're burning out the people who make this place what it is. He turned back to Sarah, his voice softening. You said Aiden sees beauty in things like rain patterns. What do you see when you look at this place? Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the question. I see potential, she said slowly. It could still be what it was, a place where people feel cared for, where they leave happier than when they came in. But it's hard when we're stretched so thin, when we're told to rush people out instead of making them feel welcome. William felt a surge of resolve. He couldn't undo what he'd done to Clara, but he could do something for Sarah, for the staff, for the soul of Haven's Grill. Sarah, I'm going to stay a bit longer tomorrow, he said. I want you to show me what you do, how you make this place special, and I want to hear more about what needs to change. Sarah nodded, a mix of fear and hope in her eyes. Okay, Mr. Carter, I'll do my best. William stood, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the tired faces of the staff who'd been watching in silence. This restaurant was built on the idea that everyone who walks through those doors, customer or staff, deserves to feel valued, he said, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. We've lost that, but we're going to get it back. Starting now. As he headed for the door, the rain still tapping against the windows, William felt the weight of his past mistakes and the flicker of a chance to make things right. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, potential. There was still potential here, and he was determined to reclaim it no matter what it took. The air in Haven's Grill was thick with tension, the kind that settles after a storm has passed, but left everything slightly askew. William Carter stood near the wobbly table by the kitchen doors, his presence as the CEO of Carter Culinary Group still rippling through the staff like a stone dropped in a still pond. The dining room was nearly empty. The last plates cleared, and the neon lights of Seattle's waterfront flickered through the rain-streaked windows. Sarah Mitchell stood a few feet away, her auburn ponytail frayed from the long shift, her hands clasped tightly in her apron, as if anchoring herself against the uncertainty of the moment. James Thornton, the manager whose arrogance had crumbled under William's revelation, hovered near the register, his face a mix of panic and defiance. The remaining staff servers, bussers, and a lone cook peering from the kitchen watched in silence, their usual post-shift chatter replaced by a nervous anticipation. William's heart pounded, not with anger now, but with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Last night he'd seen the heart of his restaurant breaking in Sarah's quiet tears, and he'd realized how far Haven's Grill had strayed from the vision he'd built 35 years ago. Tonight he was determined to start setting things right, but it would mean confronting not just James, but the systems he'd allowed to erode the soul of his first restaurant. William's eyes settled on Sarah, whose weary expression held a flicker of hope, like a candle fighting to stay lit in a draft. He'd spent the evening watching her move through the chaos of the dinner rush with a grace that reminded him of his mother, of Clara, of everyone who'd ever poured their heart into this place, only to be overlooked. He'd heard her story, 10 years of loyalty, a son with special needs, and a life stretched thin by cut hours and mounting bills. Her words from the night before echoed in his mind. "It's like we're not allowed to care anymore." That wasn't just a complaint. It was a diagnosis of everything wrong with Haven's Grill. William knew he couldn't fix it with a single conversation, but he could start by listening, by giving Sarah and the others a voice. He turned to James, whose fidgeting had grown more pronounced, his fingers drumming against the counter. "James," William said, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that made the room go still. "You've been running this place like a factory, not a family. I want to know why you think that's acceptable." James blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Mr. Carter, I was just following the directives from corporate," he said, his voice tight. "The board wanted higher profits, faster table turnover. I've increased revenue by 15% this quarter alone." William's jaw tightened. He'd seen the reports, the tidy spreadsheets that painted a picture of success, but they didn't show Sarah counting her tips with trembling hands, or the elderly customer who'd left because no one had time to make him feel welcome. "Revenue doesn't mean anything if you're grinding your people into the ground," William said, his tone low but firm. "Sarah's been here 10 years, and you humiliated her in front of a table of entitled customers tonight. You cut her hours to save on benefits, knowing she's supporting a son with medical needs. Explain that to me." James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Sarah, who stood silently, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It's not personal," he said, his voice defensive. "The new model is about efficiency. Full-time staff cost more healthcare vacation time. Part-timers are cheaper, more flexible. Sarah's a good worker, but she's slow, always chatting with customers instead of turning tables." William's eyes narrowed. "Chatting? You mean building relationships, like remembering that Mrs. Larson at table 5 likes her tea with 2 sugars, or that the kid at table 3 was scared because it was his first time eating out without his parents. That's not slow, James. That's what makes this place special." Sarah's head lifted slightly, her eyes meeting William's for a moment, a mix of surprise and gratitude flickering across her face. The other staff members, still lingering nearby, exchanged glances, their expressions softening, as if someone had finally spoken the truth they'd all felt but couldn't say. William turned back to James. You've created an environment where people like Sarah feel invisible, where they're punished for caring. That stops now. Before James could respond, a soft voice broke the silence. Mr. Thornton. Sarah said, her tone respectful but firm. I need to talk to you about my schedule. I can't keep up with Aiden's therapy costs on 22 hours a week. I'm willing to take any shift, even doubles, if you can give me more hours. James's face hardened, and he stepped closer, his voice loud enough for the entire staff to hear. Sarah, if you can't handle the hours we give you, maybe you're not a good fit anymore. There are plenty of people who'd be grateful for your job. The words hung in the air like a slap, and Sarah's face flushed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The other servers froze, their cleaning rags forgotten, and even the cook in the kitchen stopped moving, his eyes wide. William felt something snap inside him, like a taut wire finally giving way. He'd spent years building an empire, but he'd let people like James dismantle the human connection that was its foundation. He stepped forward, his full height making James take an involuntary step back. Enough, William said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that silenced the room. James, you're done. You're fired, effective immediately. The words landed like a thunderclap. James's mouth fell open, his face turning red. Mr. Carter, you don't understand. I've been meeting every target. William cut him off, his voice unwavering. You've met targets by sacrificing the people who make this place run. That's not leadership. That's cowardice. Clear out your office. I'll have someone from corporate process your termination tonight. James stood frozen for a moment, then stormed toward the back office, muttering under his breath. The staff watched him go, their expressions a mix of shock and quiet relief. William turned to Sarah, who was staring at him, her hand covering her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Sarah, he said gently, sitting across from her at the table, I owe you an apology. I built this place to be a family, a place where people like you could thrive, not just survive. I got so caught up in expansion in numbers that I let it become something else. I failed you, and I'm sorry. Sarah shook her head, her voice trembling. Mr. Carter, you gave me a chance when no one else would. This job kept me and Aiden going. I didn't want to let you down. William's throat tightened. Her loyalty, despite everything, was a mirror to his own failures. You haven't let anyone down, he said. You've been carrying this place on your shoulders, and I didn't even see it until tonight. I want to make this right. Tell me if you could change anything about Haven's Grill. What would it be? Sarah hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. The other staff members, sensing something monumental, drifted closer, their cleaning tasks abandoned. I don't know where to start, she said, her voice soft, but gaining strength. It's not just about hours. It's about feeling like we matter. We used to have staff meetings where we could share ideas, like how to make the menu more welcoming for kids with sensory issues like Aiden. I used to dream about being a chef, you know. I'd write down recipes in this old notebook, things my mom taught me, dishes that could make people feel at home. But there's no time for that now. It's all about speed, about getting people in and out. William leaned forward, his interest piqued. A chef? He asked. What kind of recipes? Sarah's cheeks flushed and she looked down embarrassed. Just silly things. Comfort food mostly. My mom's chicken and dumpling soup, or a peach cobbler that takes all day to get right. I thought maybe one day I could share them here, but it didn't seem important to anyone. William's mind flashed to his own mother's recipes, the ones that had inspired Haven's Grill, simple, hearty dishes that warmed the soul. It's important to me, he said, his voice firm. Do you still have that notebook? Sarah nodded, hesitating before reaching into her apron pocket and pulling out a small, worn notebook, its pages curled and stained from years of use. She opened it to a page filled with neat handwriting sketches of plated dishes and notes about flavors. "This is just something I do when things get tough," she said. "It helps me remember why I love this place." William took the notebook, gently flipping through pages of recipes that felt like a love letter to the art of hospitality. There was a recipe for a lavender-infused lemonade, annotated with a note about how it calmed a nervous customer. Another for a slow-cooked brisket, with a story about how it reminded a regular of his late father's cooking. William's heart swelled. This was the soul of Haven's Grill tucked away in a server's apron, ignored by a system that valued profit over people. "Sarah," he said, handing the notebook back, "these are incredible. Why didn't you ever share them with anyone?" She shrugged, her eyes downcast. "I tried once. I showed them to the last manager, but he said we didn't have time for experiments, said the menu was set by corporate." William's anger flared again, but this time it was directed at himself. He'd let corporate consultants standardize his menus, stripping away the creativity and care that had made Haven's Grill unique. "That changes now," he said, his voice resolute. "I want you to bring this notebook to work tomorrow. We're going to talk about how to bring these recipes to life. And I want you to be part of rebuilding this place, not just as a server, but as someone whose ideas matter." Sarah's eyes widened, a mix of fear and hope shining through her tears. "Mr. Carter, I don't know what to say. I'm just a server." William shook his head. "You're not just anything. You're the kind of person this restaurant was built for. And I'm going to make sure you and everyone else here feel that way again." He stood addressing the small group of staff who'd gathered, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty. "I'm not leaving Seattle until we fix this," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Tomorrow, I want all of you to come in with one idea, big or small, about how we can make Haven's Grill a place where you're proud to work, where customers feel like they're coming home. No one's getting fired for speaking up. Not anymore." The staff exchanged glances, some nodding hesitantly, others smiling for the first time all night. William turned back to Sarah. "Can you do something for me?" he asked. "Can you stay after your shift tomorrow and walk me through what a day here is like for you? I need to see it through your eyes." Sarah nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Yes, sir. I can do that." William smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him. "Good. And call me William." "No more, sir. We're in this together now." As he stepped toward the door, the rain still pattering against the windows, William felt a weight lift, but also a new responsibility settle in its place. Firing James was just the first step. The real work would be rebuilding the trust and connection that had been eroded, not just for Sarah, but for every person who made Haven's Grill what it was. He glanced back at Sarah, who was tucking her notebook back into her apron, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. In that moment, he saw not just a server, but a woman who'd kept the heart of his restaurant alive despite everything. He thought of Clara, of the chance he'd missed to make things right for her, and vowed that this time would be different. As he stepped into the Seattle night, the rain cool against his face, William knew he was at a turning point. Haven's Grill wasn't just a business, it was a promise one he'd broken, but was determined to keep. Tomorrow, he'd start with Sarah's notebook, with her ideas, and with the belief that one person's care could light the way for everyone else. The warm glow of Haven's Grill spilled onto the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, the neon sign casting a soft halo over the waterfront. 3 months had passed since William Carter, the CEO of Carter Culinary Group, had walked into his flagship restaurant, Undercover, only to uncover a fracture in the heart of the place he'd built 35 years ago. The air inside was different now, alive with a hum of genuine connection that William hadn't felt since the early days. The dining room buzzed with laughter, the clink of glasses, and the low murmur of conversations that lingered longer than necessary, as if no one wanted to leave. William stood near the entrance, his gray hair neatly combed, but his suit replaced with a simple sweater and jeans, a choice that made him feel less like a distant executive and more like part of the team. The wobbly table by the kitchen doors was gone, replaced with a sturdy one adorned with a small vase of wildflowers, a touch suggested by Sarah Mitchell, the woman whose quiet strength had sparked this transformation. Tonight, Haven's Grill was hosting a special event, a community night to celebrate its renewal. And William was here, not as the CEO, but as a man rediscovering why he'd fallen in love with this business in the first place. The restaurant had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The walls, once sterile with corporate-approved art, now showcased local artists' work, their vibrant paintings reflecting Seattle's eclectic spirit. The menu, once rigid and standardized, now featured a rotating section of Sarah's specials dishes drawn from her worn notebook comfort foods, like her mother's chicken and dumpling soup, and a lavender-infused peach cobbler that had become the talk of the city. Sarah herself stood at the pass, her apron crisp and her auburn ponytail replaced with a sleek bun, her new role as assistant chef, bringing a confidence that radiated through the kitchen. She was no longer just a server, she was a creator, her recipes breathing life back into the restaurant's soul. William watched her hand a plate to a server, her smile wide as she explained the dish's story, a recipe inspired by her mother's Sunday dinners meant to make every guest feel at home. The server, a young woman named Mia, who'd been hired full-time under the new staffing model, nodded eagerly, her enthusiasm a stark contrast to the mechanical efficiency of 3 months ago. William's heart swelled as he surveyed the dining room. The staff moved with a synchronization that spoke of trust, not fear. Servers shared tips with bussers, the kitchen staff called out orders with playful banter, and even the hostess, now a bright-eyed college student named Liam, greeted each guest with a warmth that drew smiles before they even sat down. The changes hadn't come easily. After firing James Thornton, William had stayed in Seattle for weeks, working alongside Sarah and the team to rebuild the culture of Haven's Grill. He'd held open forums where every staff member, from dishwashers to line cooks, could share ideas without fear of reprisal. They'd brought back staff meals now, a pre-shift ritual, where everyone sat together sharing stories and laughter over plates of Sarah's creations. They'd revised the schedule to prioritize full-time positions, ensuring benefits like health care and paid leave for veterans like Sarah. And they'd introduced a training program led by Sarah that taught new hires not just how to serve food, but how to make every guest feel seen, whether it was remembering a regular's favorite wine or noticing when a quiet diner needed an extra moment of kindness. The most transformative change, though, was the Carter Family Scholarship Fund, a program William had established after learning about Sarah's struggles to support her son, Aiden. The fund offered tuition assistance for the children of Carter Culinary Group employees, and Aiden was its first recipient. William glanced across the room to where Aiden, now 12, stood shyly beside the hostess stand, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he clutched a sketchbook. He was helping Liam hand out programs for the community night, his face lighting up when guests complimented his drawings, which were featured on the event's flyers. Aiden's scholarship covered a specialized art program for neurodivergent kids, a place where his love for patterns and colors could flourish. Sarah had cried when William told her gratitude so raw it had brought tears to his own eyes. Tonight, Aiden was here, not just as Sarah's son, but as part of the Haven's Grill family. His presence, a reminder that every decision William made rippled beyond the balance sheet. The community night was Sarah's idea, born from one of their late-night talks after a shift. "People want to feel connected," she'd said, her notebook open to a recipe for a spiced apple tart. "What if we had a night where locals could come together, share stories, and feel like this place belongs to them?" William had loved the idea, and tonight the dining room was packed with a diverse crowd: families, retirees, young professionals, even a group of artists from the nearby co-op. Tables were pushed together to create long communal setups, and the menu featured a tasting of Sarah's specials, each dish paired with a story printed on the menu. The chicken and dumpling soup, for instance, came with a note about Sarah's mother teaching her to cook on rainy Seattle evenings, a memory that made every spoonful feel like a hug. William watched as an elderly woman at table 6 wiped her eyes after reading the story, then leaned over to share her own memory with the couple next to her. This was what Haven's Grill was meant to be: a place where stories were shared, where food was a bridge between hearts. William made his way to the kitchen, where Sarah was plating a tray of her peach cobbler, the scent of warm cinnamon and butter filling the air. "How's it going back here?" he asked, leaning against the counter. Sarah grinned, a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Better than I ever dreamed," she said, her voice bright with a confidence he hadn't heard 3 months ago. "The team's killing it, and the customers can't stop talking about the soup. We've already had 3 requests for the recipe." William chuckled, his eyes scanning the kitchen, where the cooks moved with a rhythm that felt more like a dance than a grind. "You're not just cooking, Sarah. You're telling stories. That's what makes this place special again." Sarah paused, her hands stilling on the plate. "I never thought I'd get to do this," she said softly. "When you asked me to bring my notebook, I was scared. I thought you'd think my ideas were silly. But now, it feels like I'm honoring my mom, like I'm giving something back." William's throat tightened. He thought of his own mother, whose recipes had been the seed for Haven's Grill, and of Clara, whose memory had driven him to make things right for Sarah. "You're doing more than that," he said. "You're showing me what I forgot this place could be." The event was in full swing, now the dining room alive with chatter and laughter. William spotted Aidan at a corner table showing his sketchbook to a group of kids, his usually reserved demeanor softened by their enthusiasm. Liam, the hostess, was nearby helping a family with a toddler settle in, her smile as warm as Sarah's had been that first night. William's eyes drifted to a wall display near the entrance where a framed photo of the staff hung beside a plaque that read, "Haven's Grill, where every story matters." The photo taken at the first staff meal after the changes showed Sarah in the center, her arm around Aidan, with the rest of the team laughing around a table piled with food. It was a reminder of what they'd rebuilt together, a family, not just a workplace. William's phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his corporate team: customer satisfaction scores up 70% at Haven's Grill. Staff retention at an all-time high. Requests for franchise inquiries pouring in. He smiled, but tucked the phone away. The numbers were nice, but they weren't what mattered tonight. What mattered was the elderly man at table 10 who'd told Sarah his late wife used to make a cobbler just like hers, or the young couple at table 3 who'd left a note thanking the staff for making their anniversary unforgettable. As the evening progressed, William made his rounds, not as the imposing CEO, but as a man who'd rediscovered his purpose. He listened to a server named Javier share an idea for a weekly open mic night, nodding thoughtfully as he jotted it down. He knelt beside a little girl who'd dropped her spoon, handing her a new one with a wink that made her giggle. And he sat with a group of regulars who told him they'd stopped coming for a while because the place had felt cold, but now they were back, drawn by the warmth they hadn't felt in years. Each interaction was a reminder of what he'd almost lost and what Sarah had helped him reclaim. He found her again near the end of the night, standing by the pass, watching Aiden interact with the guests. "He's doing great out there," William said, nodding toward her son. Sarah's eyes shone with pride. "He's never been comfortable around crowds before," she said. "But tonight, he feels like he belongs." "That's because of you, William." William shook his head. "It's because of you, Sarah. You showed me what this place could be. I was so focused on building an empire, I forgot why I started. You reminded me." Sarah hesitated, then reached into her apron and pulled out her notebook, its pages even more worn now from constant use. "I've been working on something new," she said, flipping to a page with a recipe for a spiced apple tart. "It's inspired by Aiden, how he loves the way apples smell when they're baking. I thought maybe we could feature it next month, maybe tie it to a fundraiser for his art program." William's heart swelled. "It's a deal," he said. "And let's make it bigger. A fundraiser for the whole scholarship program. Every kid of every employee deserves a chance like Aiden's." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy, not exhaustion. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't have to," William replied. "You've already given me more than I can ever repay." As the night wound down, the last guests lingered reluctant to leave the warmth of Haven's Grill. William stood by the door watching Sarah train a new server, a young man named Ethan, who hung on her every word as she explained how to make a nervous diner feel at ease. "It's not about getting the order right," she said, her voice steady and sure. "It's about making them feel like they matter, like they're home." William smiled, his chest tight with a mix of pride and gratitude. He thought of Clara, of the chance he'd missed to help her, and felt a quiet peace knowing he'd kept his promise to Sarah. Haven's Grill was no longer just a restaurant. It was a community, a place where every person from the dishwasher to the CEO had a voice. As he stepped into the cool Seattle night, the rain now a gentle drizzle. William looked back at the glowing windows where Sarah and Aiden were laughing together, surrounded by their extended family. Success, he realized, wasn't about the numbers on a spreadsheet or the number of restaurants in his empire. It was about the lives he touched, the stories he helped write, and the home he'd helped rebuild. With a final glance, he walked into the night, carrying the warmth of Haven's Grill with him, ready to bring that same light to every corner of his empire.